thank you once again for coming along in our exploration of global, national, and local environmental and climate issues that affect us all as global citizens. This evening we're going to look at a very important event that occurred this last week, and we're going to look at some of the legacy of it and the outcome that's likely to ensue in the coming months and years. Basically on Friday, just about when all the news had shut down for the weekend, we heard that the President had accepted the resignation of Scott Pruitt, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, there are many people who had been hoping for his departure and actively organizing in order to ensure it, but they were preempted in some sense by the resignation of Scott Pruitt himself. What we want to look at is, in a sense, the tension that emerged, namely there was a battle over his administration of the EPA, and many people think that his departure is a big victory, and that they won the battle in some sense. But we're losing sight of the bigger picture if we don't also realize that during his 16 months in that position, we lost a lot of time and a lot of prospects for changing the direction in which we're going. So today we're going to look at this whole question of winning the battle but losing time. Scott Pruitt is out, but lost time, lost opportunities, and lost hope will remain as his enduring legacy to the world. Not just to the United States and to future generations of our own children, but to the world as a whole. And it's something we want to look at in detail because of the impact it's going to have around the world, as well as upon our children. The news came through quite literally while people were on the air.
Of, shall we say, questionable meetings he had in his capacity at EPA chief. This is the President. I have accepted the resignation of Scott Pruitt as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Within the agency, Scott has done an outstanding job, and I will always be thankful to him for this. The Senate confirmed Deputy of EPA Andrew Wheeler. He will, does it continue on? Or I presume is the interim chief of the EPA. So
the breaking story was a tweet, as we become used to in the current administration. President communicates by tweets, and in this tweet he basically announces to the world that he's accepted Pruitt's resignation. It then goes on to discuss the problem on CNN.
This is a story that has been, depending on who you talk to, a long time coming. This is a man who has faced at least 14 different probes into ethical violations during his time as this EPA chief. I think even yesterday we had a scroll just to go through the $30,000 or $40,000, privacy phone booth that he had put in his office. The fact that, according to this whistleblower, he had his public calendar scrubbed of a number of, shall we say, questionable meetings he had in his capacity at EPA chief, publicly removed from the calendar. One of the Trump hotel mattress. Sarah Ganim is with me, and Sarah Ganim can go through, as she's been covering all of these different really questionable things that this man has been a part of. And yet, Sarah, we saw him yesterday at the White House, and the president even called him out by name for the 4th of July festivities, and now the resignation. What do you know?
Well, we know this came from a tweet. Brooke, it came from a tweet from the president just moments ago. I have accepted the resignation of Scott Pruitt as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. With the agency, Scott has done an outstanding job, and I will always be thankful to him for this. The Senate confirmed Deputy at EPA Andrew Wheeler. Brooke, the tweet goes on, but I think the important thing you see here is a continued support from Donald Trump, which is what we've seen through what we are now, is 14 different investigations we're talking about when it comes to Scott Pruitt, all dealing with allegations of ethical misconduct while EPA administrator. And through the last 18 months or so that he has been in office, the president has been, at times, one of the only people who has supported him, who has stood by him. You still see part of that in this tweet. However, it does seem that some of these things, as they continue to pile on, we're catching up with Scott Pruitt.
Yes, they eventually caught up to such an extent that he decided to himself resign. The NPR had their assessment of it very quickly, looking at Pruitt's impact on the EPA.
Scott Simon is away, and so is Scott Pruitt. He resigned from his post at the EPA on Thursday. Pruitt cited unrelenting attacks on him and his family as a reason for his departure, and he certainly was under siege. There were more than a dozen federal investigations of Pruitt, ranging from looks into his relationships with lobbyists to accusations of abusive spending. But what did Scott Pruitt achieve as EPA administrator, and what will the EPA look like now without him? To help us find out, we have William Busby in the studio. He is a law professor at Georgetown University, a specialist in environmental law. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, Mr. Pruitt approached deregulation with enthusiasm. Quickly, could you just give us a sense of his principal achievements?
He had actually very few achievements. He has many proposals in the pipeline, but most are in the pipeline and most are deeply flawed.
Okay. Very few achievements, right? A lot of proposals, many of which are very flawed, according to this environmental lawyer. And so it's not at all clear that he had anything, in effect, to rack up as an accomplishment during his time in terms of regulations or actual proposals. But he did do a heck of a lot of damage, not just in the regulations he was planning, but in the way he went about them, in the way he dealt with staff, the way he dismissed scientists, the way he marginalized any input into the formulation of environmental policy under this new administration. It's really quite interesting to see upon which the issues are focusing now as an ethics issue. Not as a policy issue, but as an ethics issue.
Scott Pruitt was head of the Environmental Protection Agency for 16 months, and during his short tenure, he became entangled in a number of government ethics rules, which now start to look a little bit ragged. NPR's Peter Overby reports.
Scott Pruitt's ethics are the subject of somewhere between 12 and 18 investigations, audits, and inquiries. It's hard to know for sure because only some of the cases are public. The alleged violations include misuse of federal funds and federal employees, undisclosed contacts with lobbyists, and retaliation against whistleblowers.
I think we really do have a dysfunctional ethics system.
Washington ethics lawyer Larry Noble said Pruitt could do all this because, Noble says, President Trump doesn't care much about ethics, but cares deeply about reining in the EPA. The result? Damage to federal ethics rules, which depend heavily on voluntary compliance.
So, in effect, he got away with it because the president doesn't care about ethics. This is the man, remember, who ran on the promise of cleaning up what he called the swamp in Washington, D.C. And in fact, he then put in place people who became paradigms of swamp behavior, as in Scott Pruitt and others. So it was even too embarrassing for Trump to continue his support for him. Even the business groups that supported Pruitt early on became embarrassed by the overt corruption.
What is it going to take now to have the president publicly ask somebody to leave? What is it going to take next time? Is Pruitt the new standard?
Not everyone buys into this analysis.
I think the state of the ethics laws in our country are strong, and I think Scott Pruitt's resignation and the controversy surrounding the allegations against him demonstrate that.
Washington lawyer Eric Wang, also an ethics expert, said the Pruitt case is a display of Washington power politics, not a breakdown in ethics.
Scott Pruitt's detractors on the Democratic side were unable to force him out based solely on his policy agenda, of course, which the White House and Republican lawmakers strongly supported.
Wang said that led the left to try a different strategy.
They looked to these other issues, these personal issues, these ethics issues, to really force Republicans to put pressure on him to step down.
And it was
Well, they may have put pressure on him to step down because they weren't able to get at any of his policies because his policies hadn't been implemented. Well, the coverage in other sources in the press is really quite interesting, and we ought to look at it.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think that measuring with precision human activity on the climate is something very challenging to do, and there's tremendous disagreement about the degree of impact. So no, I would not agree that it's a primary contributor to the global warming that we see.
Scott Pruitt is out. The scandal-ridden, climate change denying Environmental Protection Agency administrator has resigned. Former coal lobbyist Andrew Murray is taking over the EPA for now. We'll speak to two former EPA officials who left the agency under Pruitt, a journalist who's closely tracked Pruitt's many scandals, plus the mother who confronted Pruitt at a restaurant just this week, telling him to resign.
So I would urge you to resign before your scandals push you out.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt has resigned amidst an onslaught of financial and ethics scandals and widespread opposition to his campaign to roll back key environmental protections. At the time of his resignation, Pruitt was facing more than a dozen federal investigations into ethical misconduct, ranging from lavish spending to asking subordinates to help his wife find a job. Just earlier this week, CNN reported Pruitt kept a secret calendar and schedule in an attempt to hide his meetings with many industry executives. And the New York Times reports Pruitt fired one aide when she objected to the practice. EPA Deputy Administrator Andrew Wheeler will become the agency's acting administrator. Wheeler is a former coal industry lobbyist, the former chief of staff for Oklahoma Republican Senator Jim Inhofe, who's known as the most notorious climate-denying lawmaker in Washington. After Headlines will host a roundtable discussion about Scott Pruitt, his legacy of environmental deregulation, and his replacement, Andrew Wheeler. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think that measuring with precision human activity on the climate is something very challenging to do, and there's tremendous disagreement about the degree of impact. So no, I would not agree that it's a primary contributor to the global warming that we see.
That is the key piece of information. We have a person who's rejected, in effect, the science, and the scientists removed them from EPA Advisory Committee, which he totally changed, in order to falsify the data that's already been achieved now for 40 years about the human impact on climate change. The other scandals are rather minor by comparison, but they do add up, and they did eventually do him in. Actually, Pruitt's problems were evident in the confirmation process itself. Damning emails were withheld by the Republican congressman from the Democratic congressman and from the public until it was too late to avoid the confirmation. Take a look.
Thousands of pages of newly released emails reveal how EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt closely collaborated with oil, coal, and gas companies backed by the Koch brothers to roll back environmental regulations during his time as Oklahoma's Attorney General. The documents were released just days after Pruitt was sworn in as the new head of the EPA, the agency tasked with curtailing pollution and safeguarding public health. Last week, Senate Democrats unsuccessfully attempted to postpone Pruitt's final confirmation until the emails were released. But Republicans pressed forward and confirmed him in a 52-46 vote, largely along party lines. As Oklahoma Attorney General Pruitt sued the EPA 14 times, the trove of new documents show how energy companies drafted language for Pruitt's Attorney General office to use to sue the EPA over environmental regulations.
Okay, talk about the swamp. That's it, right? These emails indicate that it was the petroleum companies that drafted the legislation. It wasn't legislation, it was the lawsuits that Pruitt, as Attorney General of Oklahoma, brought against the EPA. Okay, these are written by the oil companies. On the face of it, this should disqualify him automatically from becoming an EPA administrator. And had the Democrats received that information, had the Republicans allowed them to see it, the public would have gone absolute bonkers on this approval, which the Republicans rammed through in secrecy. Not a very good start, right? Especially for a president who claimed that he was getting rid of the swamp in Washington.
In an email from August 2013 from Matt Ball of the Koch-backed Americans for Prosperity to Pruitt's communications director, Ball writes, quote, "Thank you to your respective bosses and all they are doing to push back against President Obama's EPA and its axis with liberal environmental groups to increase energy costs for Oklahomans and American families across the states. You both work for true champions of freedom and liberty." These documents were obtained by the media watchdog group, the Center for Media and Democracy, after a lengthy battle. The emails were released because a judge ordered them released. For more, we go to Madison, Wisconsin, where we're joined by the group's executive director, Lisa Graves, also the publisher of Exposed by CMD.org and PRWatch.org. Lisa, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain what these emails show. You just got thousands of them in the last 2 days.
Well, these emails help show the cozy relationship between Scott Pruitt and the industries that he was tasked with regulating.
Okay. I urge you to look into this report in detail. It's absolutely staggering. He's supposed to be regulating these industries, and the emails indicate that they were, in effect, directing him. And yet the Republicans refused to get these emails released. They were ordered to be released by a judge, but they came through 2 days too late for the vote. Well, scandalous connection with the fossil fuel oligarchy were not the only outrage that Pruitt at the EPA. Dangerous and cancerous chemicals were also given a free pass under his administration, and science was continuously ridiculed, denigrated, and abandoned for ideological reasons. Take a look.
Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt faced lawmakers on Capitol Hill for a third time in less than a month as senators grilled him about a slew of scandals over his spending habits, ties to industry lobbyists, and his deregulation of environmental protections. Pruitt's currently facing about a dozen investigations, including into his $3 million security detail, his expensive first-class travel, his below-market value condo, which he rented from the wife of an energy lobbyist, and his other spending and ethics violations. Wednesday's hearing came only 2 days after Politico reported the Environmental Protection Agency and the White House has suppressed publication of a federal health study on a national water contamination crisis. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services study found the chemicals PFOA and PFOS, which are used in Teflon and firefighting foam, are unsafe for human health at levels the EPA had previously called safe. In other words, these chemicals are more dangerous than previously thought. But internal emails released after a Freedom of Information Act request show a Trump administration aide warning the EPA's top financial officer, quote, "The public, media, and congressional reaction to these numbers is going to be huge. The impact to EPA and DOD is going to be extremely painful. We, DOD and EPA, cannot seem to get ATSDR, that's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, to realize the potential public relations nightmare this is going to be," unquote. The study remains unpublished. The Pentagon's used foams containing these chemicals in exercise at military bases nationwide. In a March report to Congress, the Pentagon listed 126 military installations where the nearby water shows potentially harmful levels of these chemicals, which have been linked to cancers and developmental delays for fetuses and babies.
Okay, you get the idea here. In fact, he's suppressing the publication of a report and goes on then to bar journalists from attending the evidential hearings. Pruitt's behavior was in fact so outrageous on so many different fronts, it's impossible to sum it up very quickly. It would take hours to show the kind of offenses that he's been engaged in. But it has outraged citizens on a very local level and a very personal level. In fact, it's inspired a new kind of citizen direct action. As you can see here, take a look.
On Monday, Pruitt fled a restaurant in Washington after he was confronted during lunch by our next guest, Kristen Mink. At the time, Mink was holding her 2-year-old son when she went up to Pruitt's table. She posted a video of their interaction online.
This is my son. He loves animals. He loves clean air. He loves clean water. Meanwhile, you're slashing strong fuel standards for cars and trucks for the benefits of big corporations. You've been paying about $50 a night to stay in a DC condo that's connected to an energy lobbying firm while approving their dirty sands pipeline. We deserve to have somebody at the EPA who actually does protect our environment, somebody who believes in climate change and takes it seriously for the benefit of all of us, including our children. So I would urge you to resign before your scandals push you out.
So, Kristen Mink, there you're demanding that Pruitt resign. You think he was just following orders on Thursday?
No, I wish I could take credit for that, but there have been activists, scientists, whistleblowers, investigative journalists who have been working on Scott Pruitt and getting him out of this position for a very long time. So I'm happy to be a very, very small part of bringing some additional heat on him this week.
Well, you should listen to the whole interview. It's really quite staggering. What's coming after Pruitt? Well, in fact, fellow named Andrew, in fact, the look to the future is not very positive.
Now we have Andrew Wheeler coming in to be the acting administrator. Andrew Wheeler's going to pursue the same policy agenda that Pruitt pursued, and I think it's sort of Pruitt was a blessing in disguise for people in the environmental movement because he was so ridiculous, because he said such ridiculous things all the time. People actually started to care about the environmental deregulatory process. Scott Pruitt was, he was a symbol of what was happening. And now with somebody who's a little more low-key, who's a little more boring, to be honest, I mean, these policies aren't sexy to talk about. You want to talk about methane leaks from oil and gas operations. You want to talk about the mechanics of scientific research and how we use it to fight air pollution. You talked about Steve Malloy. I mean, he's a former tobacco lobbyist. These scientific policies are the same ones that the tobacco industry was pushing when they wanted to not be liable for the harm they were causing to human health. But Wheeler is going to be pushing those same things, and he's not going to attract the same zhuzh that Scott Pruitt did.
So Wheeler is slated to continue the issue, but everyone's going to suffer from that continuity in policy. Not just foreign countries that are getting whacked nowadays by floods, for example. In Japan, the floods are just extraordinary. People are experiencing landslides, and whole cities are being inundated by record rainfalls. The citizens of the world around the world are going to be affected, and we are going to be as well.
Please be advised, all roadways in the borough are shut down due to heavy flooding. Again, stay alive. Do not drown. Do not drive through high water at this time. All boroughs and departments are out in full force.
Pretty dire warning from firefighters in western Pennsylvania.
Firefighters in western Pennsylvania are having to deal with extreme weather. We've lost a lot of time under Pruitt and lost a lot of headway in addressing the world's biggest problems. For this kind of reason, new alliances are emerging for a sustainable future. A new kind of citizen science alliance that's going to challenge people in public space